Hello, I'm Michael Clarke and I'm in Colchester to discuss Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, who led a famous revolt against the Romans in AD 60-61. And the reason I'm in Colchester Castle here is because the Colchester Castle is built on the site of the Temple of Claudius, where the Romans, the colonists here, made their final stand as the Boudican tribes massacred them. And I'm joined by Philip Wise, who is the heritage manager for Colchester Museums. So Philip, thank you for talking to me here. And let's talk about Boudica first of all. She's a great mythical figure. She seems to be a figure of resistance to foreign invasion. She's used on the banners of suffragettes in the 19th century. She becomes almost this symbol of Britannia, this female warrior. She means so much to so many different people, but we know next to nothing about her really. So the source is very fragmentary. So in reality, as a historian, as an archaeologist, what have we got really?
Well, when we turn to look at Boudica, we actually see somebody who's almost in the shadows. Her presence in history, and indeed archaeology, is really limited. We have a handful of classical writers, historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, who write about the revolt. We have the evidence of archaeological excavations here in Colchester and in London and in Verulamium, now St Albans, to help us. And there are one or two other things that we can bring in from elsewhere in the Roman Empire as sort of comparable sources and accompanying information. But she's very insubstantial. She's sort of there, but really hard to see. And that, of course, makes her interesting.
But we're sure she existed. She was a person, and the revolt certainly took place. We're sure about that, and we can be fairly sure. We know what she did. We don't know what she was thinking. We don't know who her advisors were. We don't know who her friends were. But we know what happened in a revolt that we're pretty sure, from Roman sources, she directed. But that's not much that we can really go on after that.
No, but you are correct in that the story of the Boudican revolt was well recorded by, for example, the Roman historian Tacitus, who we think probably had about as close to first-hand information as you could get, because his father-in-law, Agricola, was actually a Roman soldier in Britain at the time of the Boudican revolt.
Yeah, he did 3 tours in Britain, and he was there at the final battle, Agricola. So his account is as close to a first-hand account as a historian is likely to get, I would imagine.
Well, that's certainly my view, that we can be reasonably confident that what Tacitus writes is based to a certain extent on real historical evidence.
Although his father-in-law might have exaggerated it.
Well, there might be a touch of old soldiers' tales here, but I think the overall pattern, the overall story, we can be reasonably confident about.
Do we know what she looked like? Or can we guess what she might have looked like?
Well, there is a description of her in Cassius Dio, which talks about having a very fearsome aspect and wearing a neck torque, an ornament around her neck, and wearing a cloak, which is sort of like the ancestor of Scottish tartan. The trouble is that Dio wasn't there, so he has probably made some of this up. But at the same time, there is evidence that you can bring in from elsewhere which might suggest that he's on roughly the right lines. I mean, she must have been a very imposing figure.
And they always talk about long hair down to a waist, but they always depicted Celtic women in this way, didn't they? The Romans were fascinated by this idea.
Yes, and there are a number of other women who we know about from the period. Cartimandra, Queen of the Brigantes up in Yorkshire, comes to mind, who's a contemporary Boudica. So yes, you're right, this sort of notion of a strong female leader appealed to the Romans.
What about the tribal structure? I mean, we know she was Queen of the Iceni when her husband died, King Presutagus. She becomes queen, but we're not talking here about a united society. We're talking about lots of tribes who didn't like each other terribly much.
Indeed. I mean, we're sitting here in the territory of the Trinovantes, who occupied largely what is now Essex and a bit of the surrounding area. And Boudica comes from further north in what is now Norfolk and parts of Suffolk. And she was indeed a representative of that tribal grouping, but it's very incorrect to think in terms of sort of a united whole. These tribes did indeed war against each other, and they formed alliances, and they broke alliances, and they went on cattle raids, and there were all sorts of things going on between the various groupings in Britain at the time.
And this queen seems to have united them for long enough to create not a national revolt, but a major revolt against the Romans. So she must have had something which could bring together previously warring tribes in this great revolt that develops in 60 AD.
Well, we'll never know precisely, of course, but I think there's little doubt that she was an imposing figure. She must have had a real stage presence. She must have had the ability to motivate her followers to do things that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily automatically want to do. And although the speeches that are given to her in the various historical accounts are undoubtedly fictitious, they probably contain the kernel of her appeal, her strength.
Well, she was probably a priestess among her people. That's not unlikely, as Queen of the Iceni, that she would have taken on this sort of priestess role. We are calling her Boudica, but if we'd been sitting here 60 or 70 years ago, we'd call her Boadicea. So what's the difference between Boadicea and Boudica?
Well, it's the same person, of course, but over time her name became corrupted. And in the medieval period, a scribe copying out one of the classical authors made a spelling mistake. It's essentially a medieval typing error. And so she became known to the Victorians, who were really responsible for her fame, actually. They sort of rehabilitated her. It's down to the Victorians that we know her as Boadicea, and that persisted well into the 20th century. So that when you and I were at school, we heard about Boadicea.
And the word Boudica is victory. Yeah,
yes.
I mean, that's the origin of the word. She was named Victory.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's talk about the revolt itself, this revolt of 60 AD. I mean, what do we know about the circumstances of this revolt and the event that sparks this enormous upsurge in anti-Roman hatred in an area that had been very settled until then?
I think when we look at the causes of the Boudican revolt, it's important perhaps to remember that it didn't just happen overnight. There were underlying tensions here in the east of England, and these were compounded by mistakes made by the imperial government. I think there was a certain amount of arrogance amongst the Roman leadership, and there was also, I feel, a certain amount of greed. The main sort of starting point for the discussion, I suppose, of the Boudican revolt is the death of Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, who had reached an accommodation with the Romans. He'd become what's known as a client king. So in return for retaining his status and a certain amount of independence, he had agreed to become an ally of Rome. Prasutagus makes a will in which he makes the Emperor Nero his co-heir with his daughters. And he did this, I'm sure, in the hope that his kingdom would survive.
And that was very common in the Roman world, wasn't it? It was a way for somebody to preserve something of their inheritance by giving half of it to the emperor.
Yes, exactly. And it was a good piece of political judgment, I think, on Prasutagus' part. Unfortunately, the Romans choose to completely disregard it and take over the entire kingdom and flog Boudica and rape her daughters. So there's a real visceral action here in terms of the Roman policy.
And that atrocity against Boudica and her daughters happens, as far as we know, in March AD 60. And we've got a very precise month for that from Roman sources. And then the revolt gathers pace very quickly between March and sometime during the summer. It seems as if these previously relatively peaceful tribes, that this event, this atrocity against the queen and the two princesses from recently died Prasutagus, the old king, much admired, and now his queen and his princesses had been savagely treated. This event then galvanizes something that builds very, very quickly.
Yes, and I think there is a contributory factor to this, which is the other mistake that the Romans make, along with their sort of military incursion into the Icenian territory. And that is that money which had been given to the Iceni and indeed to other tribes, which was regarded by those tribes as being a gift, the Romans chose to regard as a loan, and they called in all the loans at the same time, which suddenly put an immense financial pressure on the peoples that we're talking about.
So here we are in the middle of Colchester. In the Roman world, this was Camulodunum, and Camulodunum was the Colonia. It was the capital of Britannia, and just up north, 45, 50 miles away, probably around Thetford, something like that, there is this revolt building. And it's not clear what will happen to the revolt, but the rebels move, I'm calling them rebels, the tribes, they move against this Colonia. Tell us a bit about what the Colonia was there and how defensible was it?
Well, Camulodunum had initially been a legionary fortress. The 20th Legion was based here for a few years after the Roman invasion in AD 43. But it was subsequently withdrawn, and the settlement became a settlement, a colonia for retired soldiers. So we had military veterans living here, and they were placed here by Rome very deliberately to colonize, to civilize, to pacify the area, and to be a means of control of the native population. So the city was growing, and one of the big things that was happening was that the Temple of Claudius had been constructed and was in operation. The Temple of Claudius was the centre of the imperial religion. It's a bit like the Canterbury Cathedral of modern days. It's the place where you go to pay your respects to your god, and in this case it was the deified Emperor Claudius.
And here we are sitting in the Norman castle, originally Norman castle, built on the site of the Temple of Claudius, the foundations that the Normans discovered in the 11th century when they arrived here and started to build this particular structure.
Indeed, the temple was so significant that it survived long after the end of the Roman period, and its foundations were sufficiently solid and sufficiently visible to the Normans that they could build their castle above it. So we have to really be aware of the significance of the Temple of Claudius, not just as a massive building, but also what it represented. It represented the colonization of Britain, and it was built with slave labor, or at least enforced labor, and the priests who served this temple were local notables amongst the British population who saw it as a means of advancement and a means of making good under the Roman overlords, but had to pay for the privilege, so it was a real burden upon them.
So the Boudican tribes arrive, they surround Camulodunum, yes. They go to Fringringho, it seems, and then move in on the, yes. on the settlement or the colony. What happens then? I mean, this is a desperate situation now.
Well, there are a couple of things that probably one needs to stress. First of all, this was effectively an open city. Yep. It had no city walls, so you could just walk in. And the other thing to say is that the inhabitants appear to have made no attempt to make the city defensible. Indeed, Tacitus tells us that there may have been a fifth column here, that there may have been people amongst the population who deliberately thwarted attempts to make the preparations of defence effective. The other thing to say is that although there were a very small number of Roman soldiers here, it was tiny, and the reinforcements sent from London were only a few hundred men.
So in Londinium, in London, Catus Decianus sends 200 troops, which can't make any difference to anything, given what was going to happen to the colonia here. And the Romans find that they are surrounded. We don't know what the numbers are of Boudica's army, but they're much, much greater than the 20,000 people who must have been here. And it's a massacre. Last a day, 2 days maybe?
Yes, the situation must have been desperate. It was recognised, I think, by the inhabitants that their only hope was to establish a sort of strong point here at the Temple of Claudius, which did have a precinct wall around it. It could be made defensible. The inhabitants who could move here had moved here. They included veteran soldiers, of course, we shouldn't forget that, who would have been battle-hardened and experienced, as well as this smattering of troops that had been sent from London. And they must have felt that they had some hope of holding out long enough for relief forces to come, perhaps from the 9th Legion, who were based up near Peterborough at the time. But it didn't happen. They only managed to hold out for 2 days, apparently, and then Boudica's forces break in and the inhabitants are massacred.
And they incinerate the place. I mean, you and I have been looking at some artefacts here which show the intensity of the fire that occurred here.
Yes, it was a real firestorm, and we have evidence here in Colchester Castle Museum of armour that's been almost melted. We have Roman pottery that has been blackened by the temperature of the fire. We have foodstuffs, cereal grains, olives, and so on, which have been carbonised. They've been burnt to such an extent that they've actually survived in the archaeological record, which is very unusual. What's interesting, actually, is that we have never really found any evidence of what happened here in terms of human remains. There are very, very few human remains from Colchester, literally a handful. And what's been suggested is that actually the site of the Temple of Claudius was ritually cleaned after the revolt and when the temple was rebuilt. So we only really have Tacitus's account of what happened here. We don't have any supporting archaeological evidence.
And then the Romans tried to retrieve the situation. The 9th Legion that you just mentioned near Peterborough and Lincoln, they come down to do something about this. It's only a vexillation of the Legion, like a task force from the Legion. But the Boudican tribes are very clever. They think about this. They go north again and lay a trap for them and completely annihilate all the foot soldiers. Some of the cavalry escape, but they see off the 9th Legion, which then has to retreat north. And then Boudica leads the forces to the next obvious target, which is Londinium. And Londinium is not exactly the same as Camulodunum.
No, London is already a significant settlement, but it's very much a sort of commercial hub for Britannia. It's the port facility. It's where the procurator, who was like the sort of financial administrator, was based.
Yeah, but he'd left.
But he'd left by this stage.
He rushed off to Gaul.
Absolutely, yes. No, he'd done a runner, as you might say.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, London was a significant settlement, and it was a real target for Boudica and her forces. And like Colchester, it's not defended. There is no city wall at this point. And you see the same level of destruction. You see this same Boudican destruction horizon, as we call it in Colchester and London, which is a layer of burning that you can see in archaeological excavations. It's very distinctive, a very dark red layer with bits of building material and other things in it.
And the Roman commander in Britannia, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, now he's up in Wales at the time with the 14th and 20th Legions. He comes hotfoot to London with his cavalry to see what can be done, decides it can't be defended, and they leave it. And so it's wide open. And he goes north up the Watling Street to meet his 2 legions coming south from North Wales. He's picking his spot for the reckoning. And the Boudican tribes, they burn London, they massacre the people who are still there. Then they move towards Verulamium, St Albans. And so what happens after that?
Well, as with Colchester and London, St Albans is sacked and destroyed. The level of destruction perhaps isn't quite as great as here in Colchester or indeed in London, because we think that the inhabitants probably had more warning, they had more time to get out. But nonetheless, Boudica has destroyed the 3 principal Roman settlements in the southeast of England at this point. And then she seeks a final battle, as it turns out to be, with the Roman forces. Now, of course, we don't know exactly where that was. Lots of archaeologists have speculated. And most people, I think, still favour a site at a place called Manchester, which is near Atherstone in North Warwickshire on the A5, where the description provided by Tacitus of the battlefield, and remember this is based on conversations with his father-in-law who was there, Agricola, the father-in-law was actually at the battle. So it is possible to get some idea of the terrain over which this battle was fought, even though we can't be absolutely confident that we've got the right location.
But it looks like Harts Hill Ridge, doesn't it?
It does.
It does have a feeling that it's Harts Hill Ridge. Well, that's the most likely thing.
Yes.
Just before we talk about the battle, let's just think a little bit about Boudica's strategy. Because years before, King Caratacus, had been a thorn in the Roman side. He conducted a sort of guerrilla war. He was at Catavalorni, and he'd moved westwards, conducting guerrilla warfare against the Romans, basically in Wales, South Wales and Central Wales. But he was just a nuisance to them. Boudica is going for broke, isn't she? Her strategy is not to conduct a guerrilla campaign. She wants to take them on at the centre. She wants these two legions, the 14th and the 20th, coming south. She wants to take them on and beat them. Because if she can beat those two legions, she can get back to the 9th in Lincoln, Peterborough, a weakened legion. She can do something about the 2nd Legion in Exeter. She's got a very good chance of uniting more British tribes and throw the Romans out altogether. Her behaviour seems to me to indicate that she was strategically very ambitious, or she was just driven along by the momentum of it all. Don't you think?
Well, she has a very good chance of defeating the Romans because the Romans are unprepared. Their forces are in the wrong places, really, to be able to deal with her effectively. So she has the luxury of time. Her successes at Colchester, London and Verulamium, St Albans, give her that momentum to move forward. I mean, it's hard to say, of course, exactly what her motivation was. I suspect initially it may just have been revenge, just as simple as that.
And the Trinovantes, of course, wanted to take Camalodunum because this was in the centre of their territory. So for them, this was so tempting a target. But after this, she moves westwards. She doesn't sit in East Anglia. She moves to take on the Romans.
Yes.
As you say, the three big settlements, Camalodunum, Londinium and Verulamium.
Yes. And I think her strategy probably does change, or at least her ability to be able to push the Romans out gets stronger. Now you can say, well, was it the right solution to go for one roll of the dice?
Go for broke.
One battle.
Go for broke. One battle is what I'm sure that's what. Well, I believe that's what she thought.
Yeah.
One battle.
Because that would tip the balance in her favour. I mean, you're right in the sense that guerrilla warfare was very effective against the Romans. The Romans weren't particularly good at dealing with guerrilla warfare, actually. I think that's probably one of the reasons why the detachment of the 9th Legion was unsuccessful in reaching Colchester. But a guerrilla war in itself wouldn't drive out the Romans. A victory would. And you get to the stage where the Emperor Nero in Rome, who's calling the shots, he can make the decision that it's no longer worthwhile devoting resources and men and material. Nero could quite conceivably, if Boudica had been successful, have said it's not worth holding on to this province.
So we arrive at let's just call it the Battle of Watling Street, whether or not it was at Harts Hill Ridge. And two completely different sorts of forces are confronting each other. And so just tell us about the Roman army. You know a great deal about the way the Roman army was operating and structured.
Well, the Roman army was a professional, disciplined force. It had been in existence for centuries. It had built up those military traditions in the same way that we see with British Army regiments today. The troops were fit, they were trained to fight as a unit. They were rationed, they were well supplied. They had the best equipment and they had the best tactics of the period. Boudica's forces, by contrast, would have consisted of a nucleus of warriors, the warrior elite of the society, who devoted their time to the martial arts. But a lot of her forces were basically farmers who'd rallied to her defence. They weren't professional soldiers. The training that any of these men had had would have been purely individual. They would not have been trained to operate as a unit in the way that the Romans did. They didn't have the same level of equipment. They didn't have body armour, for example. They had good weapons, but not necessarily the right weapons for the sort of battle that the Romans were going to engage in.
You know what happened at the Battle of Watling Street. This is Roman tactics and discipline versus the ferocity of the Celtic tribes. And these men, remember, they were naked, they painted their bodies, they lime washed their hair and had it standing straight up, so they looked and sounded ferocious. They tried to turn to water the nerves of anybody that they faced, but it didn't work against disciplined Roman legionaries.
No, indeed. I mean, that was very much part of their tactics, was to try and achieve victory by weight of numbers, by ferocity, by shouting, by blowing their famous war horns, the carnix, which made a terrifying sound. But the Romans were disciplined, and in their general, Suetonius Paulinus, they had a man who is reported to have said to his troops, "Don't worry about all the noise. We've beaten them before, we can beat them now." And that was very sound advice at a situation where any soldier perhaps would be somewhat nervous. So at this battle, the Battle of Watling Street, we have on the one side a very well organised, very disciplined, very well trained force against basically a relatively disorganised, poorly trained and poorly equipped army. Admittedly, it's a very large army. The Romans are very heavily outnumbered, but the Celts only have one method of fighting, which is a forward rush. And the Romans survived that.
And then they drive through and they push the Celts up against their own bullock carts, all of their own baggage, and it becomes a massacre.
Yes, according to Tacitus, we can see very vividly what happened, that the Celtic, the warrior assault against the Roman lines breaks, fails, and the Romans then counterattack. And they used their two principal weapons, which was their shield. Their shield they could use to batter their opponents. It has a metal boss, a metal cover over the grip, and you can bash somebody in the face with that. And as they go in with that attack with the shield, they then use their short swords to stab their opponent in the belly. And these two fighting techniques are very effective in this sort of close order combat.
And the battle is a disaster for the Boudican tribes. Boudica seems to survive the battle. She seems to be spirited away. We don't know what happens to her after that. The assumption is that she's taken back or goes back to her own territory, somewhere in Norfolk area now. And according to Tacitus, she takes poison. According to Dio, she is buried with all her treasure, entirely plausible. We've no idea what happens to her or where she is.
Now, all we can say is that she wasn't captured, because had she been captured by the Romans, we would have known about it. So the two options are that she either did commit suicide or that she died of an illness after the battle. But as to where she's buried, nobody knows. There are all sorts of wonderful stories, including, I think, Platform 9 at King's Cross Station, which is one of the most famous and one I like particularly. But we don't know, and whether we will ever find a grave that would be identifiable as that of Boudica is a sort of a tantalising thing for an archaeologist to consider.
Philip, what does Boudica represent to you in British history? I mean, it's not quite appropriate to say what is her legacy, but what is her importance or significance in British history, from your point of view as a professional archaeologist and historian?
Well, I think Boudica is one of the first people in British history about whom we know something. There are many things we don't know about Boudica, but we know her name, we know something of her ancestry, we know something of her role, and we can use her, if you like, as a sort of representative of the people in Britain who were under Roman occupation. For me, that's a very interesting way of sort of considering what it would have been like to have lived 2,000 years ago here in Colchester. And I suppose you can also look at her in terms of her popular appeal. I mean, she remains one of those individuals from our history who is still, I think, recognised by the public today. And this is partly because of television series or films, but it's also because she seems to have entered into the sort of the almost the soul of people here locally in Colchester. So we have a primary school named after her. We have a ladies' singing group named after her tribe, the Iceni. You know, she's really made an impact here in Colchester, and I suspect possibly elsewhere as well. And so she, in that sense, she's still alive. She's still with us.
Philip Wise, thank you very much indeed for speaking to me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.